Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Center for Ballet and the Arts inaugural Lincoln Kirstein Lecture. We're very happy. Yes, it's really exciting. It's a very exciting event, and we're very happy to be having it here at Lincoln Center, which I sort of like to think of as our kind of home away from home. I'm Jennifer Homans. I'm the founder and director of the center. And before I introduce our speaker, Helen Vendler, I'm going to just take a few moments to do a few thanks and also to tell you a little bit about Lincoln Kirstein and why we created these lectures in his name. First, special thanks to Nicholas Jenkins and to Leon Wieseltier for helping in conceiving this lecture series. And next, a very, very special and warm thanks to Nancy LaSalle, who is sitting right up in the corner over here. Now that we've clapped for her, I'm going to tell you what she did. She very generously has made it possible for us to have this lecture today with a very generous gift. Nancy knew Lincoln well, and her comments about him are in your program, so I would encourage you to please read them. And on Nancy's behalf, I would also like to invite you to a reception after the lecture, which will be held out in the lobby. Now, before we turn to Helen, a brief word about Lincoln Kirstein. Lincoln, of course, was huge. And by that I don't just mean physically huge, and he was physically huge, over 6 feet tall, a large man with a large, troubled, and very generous mind. He was a towering, sometimes glowering figure, hunched over in a suit. I think of him always with a knitted brow somehow. I remember him when I was a young dancer. He would come into dance studios at the School of American Ballet, where I was a student. He would come in unannounced. He would walk right to the center of the room. And without saying a word, he would just stand there, this big figure, silently, like a great oak, a kind of pillar in the room. And then he would turn around and leave. And of course, he was also a large and towering figure in American culture in the 20th century. Yet when you think about it, I mean, Kirstein wasn't a well-known artist. He wasn't a famous dancer or choreographer. He wasn't a politician or a president or a CEO or a CFO of anything. And although he was born with some means and was a patron, it was not his money that made him important either. Lincoln was above all a man of ideas and strong convictions. And I think of him as the man who was behind so many artists and institutions that we take for granted today. He was behind them in boardrooms. He was behind them with politicians. He was behind them in print, publishing countless articles and books, making the case for things and people he believed in and against things and people he didn't. And he did this for a very long time, for most of the 20th century. Kirstein was born in 1907, and he lived until 1996. He lived through World War I, World War II, where he enlisted, was a driver for General Patton, and then became one of the monument men, digging through the rubble of the war to recover an artistic heritage. He lived through the Cold War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the fall of the Soviet Union, through the Depression, the post-war boom, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, just making the point here, 90s. Through hippies, civil rights, women's liberation, modernism, postmodernism, post-postmodernism, and through it all, through all of it, he devoted himself, we could really say unstintingly, and got behind the artists and ideas he believed in. Kirstein is perhaps best remembered for his lifelong devotion to George Balanchine and classical ballet. It was Kirstein, of course, who was responsible for bringing the young St. Petersburg-born choreographer to New York in 1933, and with him establishing the School of American Ballet, and in 1948, the New York City Ballet. No one doubts that the company would have folded many times over without him, and he remained its general director until 1989. He stood behind Balanchine, literally, for half a century. But for Lincoln, ballet was never alone. In his life and imagination, ballet was always part of what Serge Diaghilev, Kirstein called him the last impresario, liked to call a world of art. And Kirstein, like Diaghilev, was also behind and a force in film, theater, literature, sculpture, painting, architecture, in addition to dance. And I'm just going to remind us of a few of the things he accomplished. At Harvard, he co-founded the influential literary magazine Hound and Horn. He started the Harvard Society for Contemporary Art, which led to the founding of the Museum for Modern Art in New York. It was Kirstein who was behind Walker Evans in his show at MoMA, and he put himself behind Chalichev, Nadelman, Cartier-Bresson, among many others. He was behind the American Shakespeare Festival in Stratford, Connecticut, where he envisioned a national repertory company, and it was Kirstein's personal collection that seeded the dance collection here at the New York Public Library. He was, of course, behind the New York State Theater, too, and not without a lot of struggle. None of these things came easily. The struggles really were epic. And in the midst of it all, he published books, pamphlets, articles, and really fought the culture wars of his time. This, of course, is only a partial list. So just as Kirstein's life ranged across the arts, so too will these lectures given in his name. We begin this year with poetry. In subsequent years, music, drama, photography, art, film will take the stage as well. Next year, I'm pleased to say, we will welcome Ian Bostridge, who will speak on dance and song. But we begin this year with poetry. And we're doing that for two reasons, really. The first is because poetry mattered a lot to Lincoln Kirstein. And as Nancy has pointed out in her comments, he thought of dances as poems. But we begin with poetry, too, because ballet began with poetry. In the Renaissance, it was a group of poets, after all, who got together with players and musicians to create a new kind of spectacle in which rigorous rhythms of classical Greek verse would harmonize music, movement, and language into a new whole. The first ballets really were then a kind of danced song and a danced poem. To my mind, poetry is also one of the best ways to understand and analyze a ballet, which brings me to our guest, Helen Vendler. Reading Helen Vendler and following her into and through a poem, watching her illuminate it, offers, I think, a way we might also study a dance. Dances have some of the same compressed, often abstract qualities that she describes in lyric poetry in particular. And I, for one, have learned more from reading her about how to study a dance than from almost anything. So I can think of no better person to inaugurate the Lincoln Kirstein Lectures, and we are perfectly thrilled that Helen has agreed to be here with us today. And if I may, I'll just end with a small personal note, which is that it was Wallace Stevens' Necessary Angel that helped me find the title of my own book, Apollo's Angels. So now to Helen. And I'm not going to give a long list of her accomplishments and the credentials now. Her bio is in your program. I don't want to keep us any longer from hearing her. But I will just mention a few things by way of introduction. Helen Bendler is the A. Kingsley Porter Professor, University Professor at Harvard, where she received her PhD in English and American Literature after completing an undergraduate degree in, guess what, chemistry at Emmanuel College. She has written books on Yeats, Stevens, Herbert Keats, Shakespeare, Dickinson, among others, and several volumes of selected essays and reviews. She holds 28 honorary doctorate degrees, and is a frequent reviewer of contemporary poetry in such journals as the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, and the New, or perhaps we should call it the Old New Republic. The title of her lecture today is Life is Motion, Motion in Wallace Stevens. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Helen Vendler.
Oh, the brightness of the lights. I can't see you at all. It's these ones up here, the stage lights, that are sort of blinding, but that's all right. I mean, I don't have to see the audience. And besides, I'm taking off my distance glasses anyhow, so I wouldn't see you. Fine. Thank you all for being here. When Jennifer Holmans, who's the founder and director of this center, invited me to be, gave me the honor of being invited to be the inaugural Lincoln Kirstein Lecturer, she assured me that I could talk on poetry since the center firmly situates ballet among the other arts, all of which are connected by their creative invention, and all of which, and that's what the center represents, need scholarly investigation, which has been hard to do, of course, with the ballet, but a big step has been taken in Jennifer's beautiful book about the history of ballet, about which I knew nothing. Because the center is dedicated first to dance, I couldn't resist inquiring into Wallace Stevens' announcement, so strange, of the identity of life and motion. To imagine motion in a given phase of life as a symbolic equivalent to the emotional life that is going on underneath the artwork, or in parallel with it, to imagine motion as a symbol for a certain phase of life, adolescence, old age, isn't easy, nor is the effort to find verbal equivalents for ordered or disordered motion. Like every concept, motion implies its opposite, which Stevens names chaos. And I'll be talking about both poems of happy motion and poems of chaotic motion, as they exemplify Stevens' articulation of his emotions from youth to age. He thinks up wonderful things. You'll see. Stevens' extraordinary copulative claim that life is motion arrives as the declarative and philosophical title of a poem in his radical first volume, the 1923 Harmonium, published when the poet was 44. Although Stevens had been composing poetry since his student days at Harvard, writing could be at best only an intermittent activity during the several years in which he earned his law degree, held a succession of jobs, traveled as a surety lawyer, moved from Reading to Cambridge to New York to Farmington to Hartford, and married badly. But once his career in Hartford was established, the drive to write could express itself again, and he was lucky enough to compose great poems until his death at 75. What would come after a title that said life is motion? One can only reel back when one looks at the poem. Let me read it. It's very short. You have it on your handout. It's hard to take in Stevens just through the ear, so that's the purpose of the handout, so not only that you'll have it, but that you can take it home. Life, it's so grand. It sounds platonic. Life is motion. In Oklahoma, Bonnie and Josie, dressed in calico, danced round a stump. They cried, "Oh, hoy, oh, oh," celebrating the marriage of flesh and air. Isn't that peculiar? Would one expect that? But we see, as we look at the poem, this is Stevens' New World version of Keatsian classicism. Bonnie and Josie are presented as childlike nicknames, but translated, they're also among the names given two of the three Joyces, Beauty and Joy. The dancers in Stevens' poem wear not the gauzy garments of Botticellian graces, but sturdy calico. Their unintelligible cries are still syllables, not yet words. The girls are in no greenwood, not even in a place with trees. They orient their dance around the stump. Oklahoma didn't gain statehood till 1907, when Stevens was 28. All through his youth, the terrain later called Oklahoma had been an unspecified area within Indian territory. To Stevens as a boy, the territory would have seemed foreign and primitive in his New England life, and the subsequent state name, with its strange Native American syllables, Okla and Homa, may have seemed foreign as well. Stevens places his joyful dancers, the two girls named Beauty and Joy, in time as firmly as he had placed an immobile man-made jar in space a few poems earlier in his famous poem, Anecdote of the Jar. The gray and man-made jar sits in the middle of the wild world. It is immobile. By replacing his gray and bare man-made jar by two young girls engaged in intentional art motion, and by defining life itself as motion, and by reducing his former lavish Tennessee wilderness to his Oklahoma stump, Stevens withdraws ostentatiously from his earlier conception of life as an enigmatic standoff between man-made art and wild nature. The jar, he says, did not give of bird or bush, like nothing else in Tennessee. Life is motion, by contrast, relates not as standoff, but a cooperation of life and art. They mutually create each other in the motion of the dance, as natural flesh takes on aesthetic being in the designed dance motion in space. There's a whole history, of course, of the dancer before Stevens, which he would have known down through Yeats. Stevens creates a notable change in diction from the dancer's quoted cries to his narrator's stately concluding words characterizing dance as ceremony. Poem as epithalamion. Bonnie and Josie are, as graces, attendants on the goddess Venus, and we are celebrating not a marriage of two human beings, but rather the marriage of flesh and air. Dance is what marries flesh and air in an intentional choreography, occupying not only space, as the jar had done, but also time. How will this American poet, so conscious of both European tradition and American insubordination, invent original ways to represent mobility in time and space over the years? Stevens' solution in Life is Motion is to substitute for the classical three graces, all beautifully intertwined as they dance, intertwined arms. He substitutes for them two rural companions in calico dancing around a stump. He abandons intelligible classical language, of the sort that classical personages speak in Keats, for instance, in favor of the girls' elemental cries, a song without words. However, as we may hear only on rereading, their as yet meaningless syllables almost aspire to the nascent name of their young state, as though they're creating it. Oklahoma, oh, yaho, it's almost there. The American circle dance, though intentional, is folk-derived, spontaneous, and as yet untouched by high culture. But in Stevens' mind, European high culture stands behind the poem. Yet, in order to make the poem American, Stevens conceals the mythological ground of tradition, introducing it only by implication in the girls' names. Motion is created here by the primitive rhythms of the short lines, by the double meanings of Bonnie and Josie. He does that a lot. You have to think of the word behind the word. What one of my students calls crypt words in Ashbury, where one word makes two happen in your mind. By the double meanings of Bonnie and Josie, motion is created by the replacement of dance by by syllabic cries as the poem goes on, and by the change of language at the end from the simple to the ceremonial. That is Stevens at 44. If we look backward to Stevens as a 21-year-old Harvard undergraduate, we find him publishing in the Harvard Advocate. Did I say Harvard undergraduate? We find him publishing in the Advocate, the unmistakable forerunner, horrible really, of Life in Motion, which he grandly called Statuary. In this embarrassingly bad two-stanza poem, it is, you'll see, with its archaic archaic language in Hath, his young dances are not rustic, but urban, and they ostentatiously bear the divine names of Apollo and Diana. The windy morn has set their feet to dancing, young Dian and Apollo on the curb. The pavement with their slender forms is glancing. No clatter doth their gaiety disturb. Stevens at 20 is not yet aware that the pentameter, the least dance-like meter in English, hardly suits a dance poem. The title Statuary betrays the young poet's dubiousness about the status of his classical personages dancing on the curb. Are they live flesh or animated statues? Stephen ends with sententious, youthful editorializing. The young like to editorialize, and it's one of the duties of people teaching them in creative writing to make them stop. It's true. Stevens ends with sententious, youthful editorializing on the public appeal of their divine and joyous gaiety. No eyes are ever blind enough to shun them. Men wonder what their jubilance can be. No passerby but turns to look upon them, then goes his way with all his fancy free. You can see, however, that the later poem is a rewriting of this early one. How can we put classical tradition into American poems? And it's not enough to say, here are two people in New York, and they're called Diana and Apollo. Bonnie and Josie is better. In the most famous of his aphorisms, Stevens declared that a change of style is a change of subject. And the changes in style between the deplorable undergraduate statuary and the mature life is motion denotes Stevens' change of subject. At 44, rewriting Statuary, he adopts a radically different view of the motion suitable to life in America, or actual in life in America. He rejects his earlier translation, in Life in Motion, he rejects his earlier translation of the classical gods to an American city, places them instead at the treeless frontier, changes God and Goddess into two of the three graces, identifies them as young beauty and joy by his diminutives, Bonnie and Josie, deprives them of intelligible speech while suggesting that they're getting to the word Oklahoma with their approximating syllables, oho, yaho, and finally defines through his narrator the sensual spontaneity of their celebration as their dance marries flesh to air. The stump is a kind of translation of the omphalos, what you dance around. There was absolutely no believable flesh, as you can see, in Statuary, and nothing in its decor to intimate an ecstatic marriage of the body and its atmosphere. Throughout his life, as in this instance, Stevens rewrote his central motifs, always inventing a change of style to represent a change in view. Tracking almost any Stevensian concept as it mutates over the decades through poem after poem, reveals that his richest subjects, of which motion is one, generate over the years a profusion of poems, each poem, of course, hoping to bring out some unexamined aspect of that concept, or to repudiate a former view of it, his own former view of it. The concept of dance, an order designed by a human imagination and expressed by a mobile human body, is one of those rich subjects for him. However, under the solacing order and joy afforded by motion, motion implies, as every concept does, its opposite, undirected and incoherent motion, which Stevens will call chaos. the opposite thing from art, of course. By what means can he arrive at a believable chaos on the page? Before returning to ordered motion, ordered life, I need to stop to follow the track of chaos, which we will see later in several poems, but I thought it best to begin with a comparison of order and chaos so you would know where I was going. The word chaos first appears in his famous poem Sunday Morning as a synonym for the physical world. We live in an old chaos of the sun. The intelligible Copernican order has vanished. I'm sorry, both the Ptolemaic and the Copernican orders have vanished, and now the physical universe is simply no longer the 9 spheres singing harmoniously together, but rather the chaos of the sun. 13 years later, in another famous poem, The Idea of Order at Key West, the nature that opposes meaning is no longer the sun and its radiating chaos and its irrational universe, but rather the inhuman, as he says, and tumultuous ocean, with its meaningless plungings, threatening the furor poeticus, the old name for the poet's rage, as he says, the maker's rage, to order words of the sea. It's not until 1942, in middle of World War II, as you can see, it's not until 1942, in the uneasy volume Parts of a World, that Stevens tentatively and interestingly describes himself as a connoisseur of chaos. That's really a terrific linkage. Who would want to be one? How do you get to be one? By now, Stevens has seen a succession of events: World War I, the Russian Revolution, the Great Depression of the 30s, National Socialism in Germany, the rise of American Marxist literary groups, and the beginning of World War II. As he looks at this span of time, he sees that historical succession produces, as he has to admit, a variety of incompatible ideologies, philosophy itself becoming a form of intellectual chaos. With each truth, as he says, becoming over time just one more truth, one more element in the immense disorder of truths. For a moment, a wistful supposition arises to voice the poet's continuing yearning for order. But suppose the order of truths should ever come, suppose the disorder of truths should ever come to an order, most Plantagenet, most fixed. The sheer unlikeliness of this Platonic Plantagenet order in the modern world causes the poet's supposition, but suppose, to collapse. And Stevens' temporary attempt at imagining a connoisseur of chaos is itself, though appealing, unsustainable. The poem ends, this is the, where am I? Connoisseur of chaos, yes. The poem ends in imagining, connoisseur of chaos is itself, though appealing, unsustainable, and this is what Stevens proposes that the connoisseur of chaos might be able to do. He calls him the pensive man, recalling Milton's Il Penseroso, the pensive man. The pensive man, and then he tries to think of a summary description of the pensive man. He sees that eagle float, for which the intricate Alps are a single nest. Although mortal man cannot exist at that height from which the jutting Alps become a single nest, he can at least, by taking thought, conceive of such an eagle's view, a godlike view really, not tethered to life on earth. The Tennessee wilderness of Anecdote of the Jar has been transmuted into an alpine wilderness, and just as the man-made jar did not give of bird or bush, like nothing else in Tennessee, the eagle's view, we could say, does not give of human life. Troubled by the presence of Marxist and populist factions to which he cannot subscribe, and unsure of his responsibility as a poet to public issues, Stevens creates ambitious poems in Parts of a World that veer between a syntactic simplicity when addressing workers, like the simplicity in Life is Motion, and elaborate intellectual and rhetorical theses in long didactic poems with such parodic titles, wonderful, as extracts from addresses to the Academy of Fine Ideas. In the poem where he begins with the workers, called Idiom of the Hero, where are you going to get a hero from this disordered society? In Idiom of the Hero, workers, that plural noun dear to Marxist literature, workers, the workers, introduce the word chaos as they sum up their distress. I heard two workers say, "This chaos will soon be ended." Angered by the Marxist contempt for the aesthetic, Stevens bitterly refutes the workers' utopian fantasy of a better world order, wealth after poverty, wholeness after brokenness. Yet he realizes suddenly that their word, chaos, is also the correct description of his own emotional and intellectual disorder and despair. And he says of the world and himself, "This chaos will not be ended, not ended, never and never ended. I am the poorest of all. I know that I cannot be mended." The workers have no such knowledge, but he gives up on any utopian fantasy about society. For the poet, the inflexibility of the Marxist prescriptive order of socialist realism in its fixity abolishes all emotions that are and must be intrinsic to art as well as to life. Yet Stevens himself, still longing for a justification of art, pressed to those thoughts of how to justify art by all the Marxist discourse around him, turns to his own utopian fantasy of permanence. It's not as though he can give up his yearning either any more than the workers can, in that long and discursive satiric treatise called Extracts from Addresses. The Academy of Fine Ideas is a nice imagining of a satiric view of cultural gatherings of intellectuals. What he now proposes as a solution to chaos is as inimical to Marxism, to the motion that is life. Abandoning the worker diction of Idiom of the Hero, Stevens dreams of a morally static, sensual existence, undisturbed by thought, a world of irrational moods as fluctuating as that amoral guide, the weather. It is enough, that's the word with which he will end his great poem of satisfaction, final soliloquy of the interior paramour, in which being there together, he says, is enough. Enough is the word of highest satisfaction for him. But here he is evading what might guarantee the word. And he remains superficial. It is enough to believe in the weather and in the things and men of the weather and in oneself as part of that, and nothing more. Nothing more precludes any I have a word that's mistyped. Nothing more precludes any departure from this sensual belief. There is nothing more, so I can't leave the sensual floating with the weather apart. This nothing more is as utopian in its way as the economic hope of the workers. Stevens maintains this affectation of anti-intellectual, sensual complacency. Let's just go up and down with the weather, with the clouds, with the rivers, meaningless motions, as he said in The Idea of Order at Key West. But such anti-intellectual, sensual complacency can't last and completely collapses in a time of war, so that the poem ends, "Blood smears the oaks. A soldier stalks before my door." And you can't say to the soldier, "I'm feeling that it's a cloudy day today." It just doesn't work. Oh, he gives that up, but not without reluctance. Stevens, in midlife, is convinced of the impotence of philosophical ideas as they have been classically presented. Whether they're classical or Christian or Marxist or hedonistic, they're all equally partial. He doesn't see that philosophical ideas can offer a valid sanction for existence. So he places a new confidence in individual feeling, intrinsically trustworthy as ideas are not. Speaking of himself in the third person, as he often does, Stevens, who always became depressed in winter, now Stevens, in wonder, finds his former wintry self thawing in an April that releases torrents of feeling. As extracts ends, present participles insisted on articulate for the poet the joyous motions of resurgent being, as if the ing of being itself generated a blooming of life in participial form. Winter would be broken and done, and being would be being himself again, being becoming seeing and feeling in self, black water breaking into reality. With its awakened trust in, did I skip something? No. With its awakened trust in feeling, life can once again be analyzed as motion instead of as some kind of paralysis, as the poet encounters warmth, an excitation of the senses, a renewed self. In spring, being almost eliminates in this exhilaration the difference between nouns and verbs, as the tautology being would be being something or other insists on life energy as the primal good, manifested as the black water of depressive winter, and then with the melting of ice into the seeing and feeling of the restored senses in April. In Stevens' next volume, the post-war publication bearing the grateful title, Transport to Summer, after the winter and then the spring. This is, a wonderfully hopeful title. He has a poem in Transport to Summer called by the sleepwalking name Somnambulisma. It offers, you have the whole thing. I should explain that there are 4 poems quoted whole here, and they have titles at the top. The poems that are not quoted whole, the excerpts just have titles and pages at the bottom. But this is the whole thing. This poem, Somnambulisma, offers a strange parable of the interactive motions of the ocean, a bird, and a scholar. These 3 realities are invoked to describe the unity of being, seeing, and feeling when happiness comes. Stevens creates an allegorical personage, the scholar, sometimes he calls him rabbi, whose mental motions enable the completion of poetic imaginings. Nature and the poet can only go so far until the scholar enters the picture. The scholar is one of the 3 figures here of life as motion. The first is the rolling sea of the physical universe. The second is a restless bird longing to inscribe himself with his claws on the unstable sand. And the third is the absolutely necessary creative scholar, Stevens' personification of the creative power of learning when it has become inseparable from emotion. The motions of life manifest themselves. The ocean rolls, the bird makes futile attempts to leave a trace on the sand, and the scholar makes the indispensable final contribution to the poem. The scholar is defined as someone feeling everything, who is clothed not in imperial regalia, but in individual personalia, a nice invention of a new word on the basis of regalia, the King Rex. Without the scholar's fertility of learning and imagination and feeling, nature itself would be, says Stevens, a geography of the dead. And then speaking of all the dead of the human past, not the afterlife to which the authors consign them, but something else. Without the scholar, nature would be, says Stevens, a geography of the dead, in which no scholar, separately dwelling, poured forth the fine fins, the gawky beaks, the personalia, which, as a man feeling everything, were his. By eking out with fine-growing fins and young beaks the suggestive contours of the interaction of ocean and bird, the scholar who dwells apart in solitude enacts the divine fiat of Genesis, or completes it, In TheScholar, Stevens has found a figure to incorporate the ingenious and free motions of the intellect in poetry, but he maintains the necessary aesthetic hierarchy of functions. The intellect is necessarily subordinate to the originating will of the bird who wants to make that inscription and moves restlessly and never settles. The intellect is necessarily subordinate to the originating will of the bird and the sensuous scene setting of nature, because without the ocean you wouldn't have the bird. But poetry would not be complete without the third ingredient, as I said, subordinated to nature and the restless and creative bird longing to write its poem but unable to do so. It's a very old image. One day I wrote her name upon the sand, and then the sand always wipes away the name. So here's the poor bird translated from Renaissance idealistic versions like Spencer's of I wrote her name upon the sand. Poor bird can't write bird on the sand. In such a poem, Stevens makes us aware of his own subjection to the unintelligible ocean of nature, his own frustration in trying to inscribe himself on the shore, and of his own amusement-tinged joy in seeing his mind add a final elegance to form. In the parable, we see an aesthetic and perfected composite of grand nature, elevated inscriptive intention, and intellectual joy. For all its initial frustration, it ends as a happy poem. The apprentice has seen, as he sleepwalks, the arrival of his masterpiece of personalia, that is a style inseparable from itself, as the intellect takes the beaks of the baby birds and makes them adult, or takes anything and makes it what it is and going to be. Stevens is ready, after his high investment in the emotions, to invent in his 1947 famous sequence, Notes toward a Supreme Fiction. He's ready to invent the poetry that satisfies him, which he defines as the fiction that results from feeling, implying boldly that unless you had the feelings to start with, you would never make up the myths that embody them. The fiction originates itself again and again, culture by culture, but the initial pleasure of a new cultural synthesis, moral, erotic, intellectual, symbolic, that pleasure grows weaker as its repetitions seem more and more routine. By this time, Stevens has been doing insurance company work for many decades, and there's something he loves about the routine. He continued to go into the office till he died and turned down an invitation to be the Norton lecturer at Harvard because he knew if he went away, they would never let him back in the office. He's so old. So he did take pleasure in it. Nonetheless, when routine supervenes on your original excitement about some adventure of the mind or soul, as a culture wanes and meaninglessness seems truer than meaning, the act of motion feels almost mechanical. Birdsong, for instance, in Notes, becomes a thing final in itself and therefore good. One of the vast repetitions final in themselves and therefore good. The going round and round and round, the merely going round until merely going round is a final good. Well, this is someone trying to convince himself, of course, of the beauty of routine. But he's always a comic poet in everything. I mean, his sensibility is comic. Not every poem is comic. But if you wanted to represent routine and didn't know what to say about it, well, it's not a myth. It's not a religion. It's not a sexual partner. I mean, what is it? And why am I living it? And do I like living it, or should I just kill myself? I mean, that's really what's behind the despair when he can't find an anchor for his poems. An earlier poem called, ironically, The Pleasures of Merely Circulating, had already mocked as insufficient the ancient classical myth of life's cyclical recurrence, embedded in its predictable plot in which the age of gold declines into the successive ages of silver, bronze, and iron, and then returns as gold again. The primal paradise, the garden visited by angels, declines in this poem As the cycle repeats itself, the angel descends from the clouds, and then the poem babbles, sort of, in the utter vacuity of childlike pleasure in watching in human nature in the merely circulating clouds. The garden flew round with the angel flew round with the clouds, and the clouds flew round, and the clouds flew round, and the clouds flew round with the clouds. I mean, you could think of it as legal cases coming to his desk. You know? The case flew around in the office. The office sent it out to some place, and then finally it circulates in the office. The clouds flew round, and the clouds flew round, and you think they're going to get somewhere, of course, but all they get is each other, and the clouds flew round with the clouds. Stevens confronts these inane, if pleasurable, motions with the deathly aspects of life, brought to mind especially by this mindless routine of merely circulating, going around and around. The deathly aspects of life are those that the mindless routine can neither encompass nor describe. So the poem ends, after all these ridiculous things about the angel flying and the clouds flying, the poem ends, is there any secret in skulls, the cattle skulls in the woods? Do the drummers in black hoods rumble anything out of their drums? And that's the end. These are unignorable threats of death. The animal skulls, we don't bury animals in the same way as we bury each other, so we don't have evidence of rotting humans lying about, but you do have that evidence in animals. These are unignorable threats of death. The animal skulls denoting unavoidable organic mortality, and the awful reduction of music to drumming on, off, on, off, on, off. It's only a single motion. All motions reduced to a sort of metronomic ticking in the drumming, produced by black-hooded funereal attendants. Although Stevens has meditated on death often, declaring in Sunday Morning that death is the mother of beauty, without transience we would get bored by the office, and by even beauty itself. Well, the death is the indispensable ingredient in the creation of anything that lives and moves. Against that background, he has meditated on death, but he has seemed to evade, or at least to postpone, bringing into full view two events to which pleasure, whether sensual or intellectual, to which pleasure, whether sensual or intellectual, is no remedy. These two events, of course, are tragedy and death. Are they not included in the aphorism, life is motion? Stevens' relatively unconvincing gestures to catastrophic motions in wartime now find more authentic personal equivalence. Life's motions in the poet's anticipations of death. That's what all the chaos poems end up being about. The conclusiveness of death does away with all those earlier fantasies of eternal recurrence, even in the boring form of the routine. How shall the poet find figures for the motions and emotions surrounding his anticipation of death? Stevens' admission of death into the precincts of his imagination prompts a serious inquiry into the fundamental opposite of order, chaos. For Stevens, chaos is and remains an unbearable concept, first truly explored in his great poem of old age, Chaos in Motion and Not in Motion, showing the philosophical axiom that a thing cannot be and not be at the same time in the same way. He said, you don't know chaos. Chaos can be in motion and not in motion inside your head. Chaos comes late in the 1947 volume, Transport to Summer, lurking under the poems of barely rescued happiness. I'm skipping the next quotation. By abandoning unsustainable fancies of even minimal resurrection, and by conceding that life is always incorrigibly tragic in itself, Stevens is forced into more truthful imagery. Perhaps, he thinks, one can mute one's personal and present pain at the apprehension of death by taking a long historical view. In a poem published during World War II, Dutch Graves in Bucks County, Stevens addresses the successive generations of his dead Pennsylvania Dutch ancestors. Dutch is a corrupted form in that name of Deutsch. They were all Germans, not Dutch. His ancestors in their sooty graves, ash is the substance really of graves. His ancestors in their sooty graves with their distant historical overview can, he thinks, surely regard the chaos of these violent marches of the present in World War II as merely one epoch of human expression, after which reassuring periods of peace will prevail. But Stevens must abandon this on-off version of culture. Yes, we have a war, and then we have some peace, and then we have a war again, and then we have some peace. You know, because the same people are not there anymore who had the violent culture, and so they don't like the new peace. They have to make it their own. And he says, this is the pit of torment, that placid end in peace should be illusion, that the mobs of birth avoid our stale perfections, seeking out their own, waiting until we go to picnic in the ruins that we leave. The mobs of birth, mobs of course always associated with revolution, violent revolution. The mobs of birth are Keats's hungry generations that tread down their parents when he says to the nightingale, "Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down." And that's a terrible cannibalistic image of the next generation crushing their parents. In the savage evolutionary motion of history, every cultural perfection disabused of its self-illusions of permanence. They have gone stale, the aspects of permanence of the previous culture, when they're not immutable. Earthquakes are immutable, but this is more about the feelings that you can displace your anxiety about your own death into a whole lot of dead people, your ancestors, in a cemetery, and saying, well, you don't feel the present pain of it. You see the long historical view. In the savage evolutionary motion of history, every cultural perfection perceives in torment its own abolition. A long view of history does not mitigate the force of inevitable destruction in an individual life. Stevens' search for adequate motions of consciousness in old age culminates in the great poem I have already mentioned, Chaos in Motion and Not in Motion. A poem I didn't understand at all at first. It seemed so crazy and so unlike Stevens' other poems. But of course, as he said, a poem must resist the intelligence almost successfully. Wonderful sentence in one of his poems, and an aphorism. Stevens' search for adequate motions to represent consciousness in old age culminates in this great poem, Chaos in Motion and Not in Motion. In old age, the declaration that life is motion holds true, but in a new and horribly different way. In Chaos in Motion and Not in Motion, we see a pitiful and comic and appalling portrait of a person suffering the frantic and yet leaden feelings of old age. Remembering once again his German origins in the Pennsylvania Dutch, Stevens satirically presents his turbulent and anxious self as Ludwig Richter, turbulent schlemiel. He never called himself anything like that anywhere else. But it's true, but he can't even value himself in the state in which he's in. If life is motion, what sort of life is this new and paradoxical motion in which intense accelerations of the sense of time are accompanied and opposed by an absolute paralytic stasis in which nothing at all is happening or can happen? In age, do the outward yearnings of both bodily desire and individual thought, in their depressed search for adequate objects of desire and the adequate repose of intellectual truth, do these fade into barrenness? Not quite. The speed of experience becomes more and more surreal. In old age, life is still motion, yes, but the swarm of motions in the mind becomes intolerable in its vortex of incoherence. We are already nearing the end, says the poet. We are in the fourth act of the 10th scene in the 10th series of our spinning spectacle, and chaos whirls around us in macabre motion. It lays bare the tatters of our Western culture, from theology to opera. The impotent churches have become deaf to prayer and mute in prophecy, and Wagnerian sopranos desert their exalted arias for the boredom of repetitive scales. The animating spirit of chaos in motion and not in motion, Stevens' wind, is not the Pentecostal wind of consolation, nor the Shelleyan west wind praying for the spring zephyr, but a wild wind of incipient death, bringing into a summer day an apocalyptic thunderstorm of lightning and winter rain, torturing the poet with the deadly acceleration and irrational violence of his final days. He begins, oh, that this lashing wind were something more than the spirit of Ludwig Richter. The rain is pouring down. It is July. There is lightning and the thickest thunder. It is a spectacle. Scene 10 becomes 11 in series Roman numeral 10, Act 4, etc. You can see that we're heading down to the end once you're in Act 4. People fall out of windows, trees tumble down, summer is changed to winter, the young grow old, the air is full of children, statues, roofs, and snow. The theater is spinning round, colliding with deaf-mute churches and optical trains. The most massive sopranos are singing songs of scales. I have no idea what optical trains are. I mean, obviously he made up something. Maybe it was even floaters going by in his eye, that became like linked, I don't know. I love it as a completely unintelligible picture, optical trains. In this chaotic collision of theater, impaired churches, and surreal optical trains, the spectacle exhausts itself. And as he closes the poem, Stevens sums up his encompassing deprivation, his inability, though desire has not died, to think of a single thing he actually desires. He feels the chill of standing intellectually outside of his own life, in cold observation of its epistemological and temporal dissolution, and, most terrifying of all, registers a rage at the absolute absence within himself of any genuine feeling, as he becomes, at the climax of his frenzied confusion, all mind and violence and nothing felt. The destructive wind, which matches his own inner turbulence, obliterates even speculation. The poet has, in the totalizing presence of death, nothing more to think about. There is, of course, no future. What were you going to think about? And Ludwig Richter, it ends, and Ludwig Richter, turbulent schlemiel, has lost the whole in which he was contained, knows desire without an object of desire, all mind and violence, and nothing felt. He knows he has nothing more to think about, like the wind that lashes everything at once. Stevens will never invent a better set of equivalents for mental terrors, but brilliant as the poem is, its chaos is not his last word on life as motion. Yes, in his own room he is impelled to extinction by what seems a malign fate, but when he looks to the sublime motions of the universe, not his personal emotions or motions, not the historical ones of his buried ancestors, but rather the motions ordained by immutable physical law, he abandons his rage against the fate bent on extinguishing him personally. Necessity is indifferent to our lives. He writes a whole part of a long poem about the Greek ananke, who's the Greek name for necessity. As long as you see it all as not attached to a body, but rather attached to the universe, the chaos is not personally wounding. Necessity is indifferent to our lives. It is no Hardy-esque specter of the spheres, but rather a mathematical result of the billions of convergences that bring about change in all things, even in the heavens themselves. Life is motion. What are the motions of the failing life that contemplates a future of nothing but losses? The beautiful and pitiless universe exhibits the sublime motions, he says, of the serpentine aurora borealis, those northern lights that had already been the subject of poems by both Emerson and Dickinson. If your two predecessors like that have written about the northern lights, there's a terrific temptation. Well, I'll see what I can do with it. There's a kind of competitiveness about what you can do with a motif. The auroras of autumn, Stevens' greatest sequence, is a stunning exploration of the unpredictable, but fascinating the auroras of autumn is an exploration of the unpredictable but compelling motions of those constantly changing celestial waves of color. The scholar poet is on earth below with a single candle in his solitary cabin. There's great pathos as he says what has happened to his mother, the mother as he calls her. She has grown old. The necklace is a carving, not a kiss. All turned to woodenness in death. In part of the poem, the poem is very long and has many, many motions. Here's the solitary poet in the cabin when he opens the door. He opens the door of his house on flames. The scholar of one candle sees an arctic effulgence flaring on the frame of everything he is, and he feels afraid. The Stevensian aesthetic, which has been rendering life by inventing words and images and structures for the characteristic motion of each human stage, finds its ultimate replica, his aesthetic, when he really wants to find the right symbol for it at the end of his life, is these northern lights. Beautiful as they can be, but having absolutely no interest in us at all. They are, so to speak, the simulacra of the mind in its terrifying, he finds the simulacrum of the mind in the terrifying but beautiful late life aurora, itself so various, changing second by second to defy definition. And in that way, it becomes a plausible symbol for consciousness, which also changes second by second. You can't pin it to any one of its manifestations. Stevens' lines about the aurora, trying to define it, send out casts of the imagination seeking to identify and interpret the unpredictable motions of the northern lights. He ventures different definitions. It is a theater, floating through the clouds, itself a cloud, although of misted rock and mountains running like water, wave on wave through waves of light. It is of cloud, transformed to cloud, transformed again, idly, the way a season changes color, to no end except the lavishing of itself in change. As light changes yellow into gold, and gold to its opal elements, and fire's delight. The aurora does this, it splashes itself. These things are splashed wide-wise because it likes magnificence. I like magnificence. Why shouldn't I have it? Why shouldn't I consider my consciousness as magnificent if it can do all these changing things, second to second to second, all of the beautiful? Splashed wide-wise because it likes magnificence and the solemn pleasures of magnificent space. The aurora has the whole of the skies as its context. Magnificence is the chief of the Aristotelian virtues in Spenser's Faerie Queene, coming from the notion that the king is the only person who can be called magnificent. He's the only person who can disseminate benefits to the whole, what shall I say, the whole world, and the whole world of his kingdom. And so when Stevens takes the concept of magnificence and removes it from King Arthur, who was going to embody it if Spenser ever finished the poem, which he didn't, but nonetheless King Arthur is the king, and he is the one representative of magnificence. When you change it from a worldly king in a human court and put magnificence up there in the realm of non-intentional changing beauty, you have given Spenser, who was so troubled by mutability, the last two mutability cantos and the Fairy Queen are so troubled by the constant change that everything goes through, and thinks he can find a stability for that change only in heaven. And Spenser says at the end, "O thou great Sabbath God, grant me that Sabbath's sight," the eternal Sabbath. No eternal Sabbaths here, only this wonderful energy in the auroras, and not doing it with a purpose, not doing it with an argument, not doing it with logic. The cloud drifts idly through half-thought-of forms. Who could not say that of the mind in meditation or in reverie? The workings of the aurora as it drifts idly through half-thought-of forms parallel the drifting motions of subjectivity itself. Yet the poet must depict the destructive energy of the universe as well as its lavish magnificence. If life is motion, what life is implied by the fearful electrical motions in the heavens? It is the life of old age, lived in the painful recognition of griefs and extinctions. As we watch, the aurora goes about its wild work of slaughter. Our friends and lovers, our parents and our children are swept away before our eyes, and we remain the shivering residue of combustion, stripped of emotion. The aurora. It leaps through us, through all our heavens, leaps, extinguishing our planets one by one, leaving of where we were and looked, of where we knew each other and of each other thought, a shivering residue, jeweled and foregone. Then, in this very surprising turn, Stevens asserts that since the motions of the cosmos are necessitated by physical laws, they are innocent of any malignity against us, even though they are the instruments of our obliteration. So then, he says, making up his mind about the auroras, at least momentarily, so then these lights are not a spell of light, a saying out of a cloud, but innocence. The person who speaks out of a cloud is always a supernatural person, and a spell brings up the notions of wizards and the manipulation of magic. It's not divine, it's not magical. So then these lights are not a spell of light, a saying out of a cloud, but innocence, an innocence of the earth, and no false sign or symbol of malice. You remember that it was thought that in Adam's fall, the whole structure of the world came apart. And he is saying, and then therefore there's Sid, and therefore the temptations that follow it and the failings that follow it. And he says the heavens are not like that. The heavens are enjoying themselves. And they are not telling us divine commandments, and they are not instructing us about anything ethical. Although the auroras of necessary fate may be indefinable, they remain a dazzling and powerful manifestation that unavoidably suggests moral and epistemological equivalence. When you say, what do the auroras symbolize? You can't leave out the ethical as it relates to human beings because you don't want to be like the auroras going around and killing everybody. And is that nature, or should we aim at a better nature? Stevens will be dead in 5 years, and yet he has the energy to ask rhetorically, drawing on St. Matthew's Gospel. He has the energy to ask rhetorically whether there is in the universe an imagination that sits enthroned, as grim as it is benevolent, the just and the unjust, which in the midst of summer stops to imagine winter. In Matthew 5:45, Jesus says of God, "He maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and the unjust." As long as the oceanic auroras in the skies and the responsive imagination in the heart are in motion, so is the poet, and so is his currently apocalyptic life. Stevens could scarcely have foreseen the next phase of bodily existence. You never know what's going to happen when you're old. I mean, you have very strange emotions, one, as he says in Chaos. Stevens could scarcely have foreseen the next phase of bodily existence in which there is no mind, and no spectacle, and no violence, and nothing felt. Silence falls, and there is nothing to say. The hitherto ceaseless metaphorical alchemy by which experience is transformed into language has died. Finally, the poet's field of view goes completely blank, as his past world is merely erased. It's like an exhibition of the senility of old age, where you don't know anybody and you don't recognize anything anymore, as he says of his world. The physical universe, in a clear day and no memories, which is a terrifying title, you can see everything, but the other part, the whole backward train of your mind has been erased. In a clear day and no memories, the mind is, as he says, not part of the weather, no longer changing as the weather changes or as the aurora changes. And even the motion of the physical universe, when you are in this state of senility, has become an invisible activity. You no longer know the laws of physics or anything else. The whole energy of the universe, which is a satisfaction to know, now has deserted him too. Today the air is clear of everything. It has no knowledge except of nothingness, and it flows over us without meanings, as if none of us had ever been here before and are not now. In this shallow spectacle, this invisible activity, this sense. The nothingness has no accompanying presence, unlike the nothing in the famous earlier poem, The Snowman. In actuality, the snowman lives among a wealth of presences in a landscape of winter beauty. Around him are the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun. When the poet at the end of The Snowman says that he sees nothing that is not there and the nothing that is, he has perhaps killed his aesthetic nostalgia for the deciduous trees of the erotic past, but hasn't yet advanced to the point where he can recognize the beauty of snow-laden evergreens glittering in a bright sun. The glittering landscape of winter is invisible to the mourner of summer. It adds up only to the nothing that is. The snowman can affirm in his later evolution, in the plain sense of things, that the absence of the imagination had itself to be imagined, required, as a necessity requires. The life that is motion nonetheless persists, thinks the poet, if not in his own life, and not in the visible universe around him. The life that is motion nonetheless persists, he thinks, in what he invents as an abstract form of landscape. It's a Platonic form. If the idea is up there, and then the instances of it down in this world are always imperfect copies of the beautiful thing in the Platonic superhuman level. The life that is motion nonetheless persists, thinks the poet, in an abstract Platonic form of landscape, a virtual landscape devoid of human emotion, without human thought. Emotion and thought are what the realm of the pure idea, capital I, lacks, until each generation arises and infuses into the Platonic geometry both human feeling and human meaning. The landscape of being that we saw before, just being, mere being, as Stevens calls it, mere being, seems to exhibit in its minimal Platonic imagined form each item that the world of artifice might need, the basic items: a palm tree, all exoticism and nature, a bronze stage set, the bronze decor, I'll be reading this in a second, and a golden bird. But Stevens rebukes the notion of the inertness of the Platonic forms, as they simply are there, ready to be imitated. He rebukes the notion of an eternally static set of Platonic ideas by animating its forms into continuing action. The palm rises, the bird sings, a wind moves in the branches. Stevens' ideal landscape quivers with potential, ever ready to grow from its tableau-like stasis to living motion. In the virtual realm of the abstract idea, life is hovering or quivering, not ended. Of Mere Being, the poem of Mere Being, affirms on a conceptual plane the eternal present tense motions of reality. They never die. They're always up there in the forms. You can't have forms that are simply static because so much of any form is motion. Of Mere Being affirms on a conceptual plane the eternal present tense motions of reality. This is his last poem in the collected poems. The palm at the end of the mind, beyond the last thought, rises in the bronze decor. A gold-feathered bird sings in the palm, without human meaning, without human feeling, a foreign song. You know then that it is not the reason that makes us happy or unhappy. The bird sings, its feathers shine. The palm stands on the edge of space. The wind moves slowly in the branches. The bird's fire-fangled feathers dangle down. If it is not the reason that makes us happy or unhappy, where is happiness to be found? Of Mere Being claims that we find happiness in our mental tableaus of human potential, or of the universe's potential, ever on offer to seeing and hearing. Because of the attraction these tableaux of possibility exert on us, human desire infiltrates the realm of mere being and begins to activate it in words. The phoenix of fire-fangled feathers seems to promise future flight as soon as its wings lift. And the motion in the wind, the singing of the bird, the rising of the slender palm, all import a hovering action ready to begin. The characteristic Stevensian moment of verbal play, because artifice is one of his intrinsic conceptions of art, that it isn't transcriptive, it is symbolic, and it has to find a moment in which words play with each other and are amused by each other. And here it is, of course, the bird's fire-fangled feathers dangle down. A wonderful line. The characteristic Stevensian moment of verbal play, as the bird's fire-fangled feathers, by sonic contagion, dangle down, intimates that word play is intrinsic to the events emerging in this atmosphere, acting as a bridge joining the symbolic pictorial pictorial motion in Platonic space to existential motions of our own. The limited number of life phases, infancy, childhood, youth, and so on, makes it necessary for each capable poet, each capable lyric poet, to seek out an original and personal and accurate set of images and idioms, and to forge them into a recognizably idiosyncratic style. The function of that style is to represent, in Hopkins' words, the own, the abrupt self there. You have a blow of a new self coming at you through words. The own, the abrupt self there. The motions of life, as Stevens lives it, beholds it, feels it, and remembers it, synchronize themselves with motions of style unforgettably his own. Who but he could have invented to match old age's rage and dejection, chaos in motion and not in motion? When we remember the adolescent Harvard graduate who set Diana and Apollo dancing in what is probably New York, we realize how far his style, inherited from European poetry, had to travel, how often it had to mutate if it was to map his American world and the kind of art that it must construct for itself. You don't end with Bonnie and Josie, of course. You end with the state of Oklahoma being tilled and made fertile and made happy as art itself evolves into perfection. Of Mere Being, the last poem, displays the conjoined boldness and ease with which Stevens could transform Platonic ideas into a minutely potential sphere of human action. Stevens sets of mere being, the scene of mere being, in an eternal present tense, eternally available to the poetic imagination. He has the bravura to announce, as the motto of the scene, it is not the reason that makes us happy or unhappy, thereby freeing the Platonic idea from the chill of abstract reason, which always entails, of course, the notion of temperance, a notion that is not especially dear to art. Stevens knew how slight the motions can be that begin to activate life in the human ear and eye. The bird sings, its feathers shine. Above all, he dares to show that the realm of the classical idea of reason lacks the essentials, human meaning, human feeling, which only the artist can provide. The bird does sing without human meaning, without human feeling, a foreign song. It is only the artist who can make the song become native to our own moving life. Of Mere Being, in its firm rejection of ever-temperate reason, is recalling Keats's sonnet sometimes called What the Thrush Said. Keats was in bed. He had been hit by a billiard ball in the eye. He was feeling very guilty about his indolence. And then he suddenly hears the thrush singing. And the thrush says to him, I should say that Keats's sonnet, What the Thrush Said, rejects the rule of knowledge, just as Of Mere Being rejects the rule of reason. And what the thrush said to the poet is, "Oh, fret not after knowledge, I have none, and yet my song comes native with the warmth. Oh, fret not after knowledge, I have none, and yet the evening listens." Listening to Keats's thrush, Stevens writes his own version of the primal value of the objects of ear and eye, the bird, the feathers. In the tableau of the ideal, as we know, the only admitted senses are hearing and seeing, called the higher senses because they can occur without physical contact with the object. Smell, taste, and touch can enter only after the aesthetic will brings the distant ideal into the full-sensed terrestrial, transforming the conceptual to the embodied, vivifying the abstract quivering landscape into a magical awakening. The mere being, then mere being, becomes the earthly paradise, and life takes on motion once again, this time in art.